Flip monsters have been an important part of Yu-Gi-Oh's identity going as far back as the game's first set, The Legend of the Blue Eyes White Dragon. In older formats, their effects were so powerful that they were placed in a lot of different strategies, to the point where a ton of flip monsters were considered staples. However, in the modern era, it's fairly rare to see a deck play flip monsters anymore, which is why today we're going to discuss the glory days of flip monsters, their fall from grace, and how their role has changed in the modern game. So, what actually is a flip monster? A flip monster is a specific subtype of monster that has an effect that's highlighted by the keyword flip. The word flip usually means that a particular effect will trigger whenever the card is flipped face up by any means, whether that's being flip summoned, flipped up by battle, or being flipped up by a card effect. Now, there are exceptions to this rule. There's a few flip monsters that don't have trigger effects when they're flipped face up, and instead will only apply a continuous effect like Aroma Jar or Death Ex Crawler. But these monsters are still treated as flip monsters regardless. Likewise, there are also a ton of monsters that do have trigger effects when they're flip face up, like Yugioh Armor and Snowman Eater. These cards might be mechanically the same flip monsters, but they aren't actually treated as flip monsters themselves. As a result, there's no hard and fast rule for what a flip monster can actually be, with the only real consistent theming being that you'll usually need to flip a monster face up to get access to its effects. In the modern era, however, this is usually a huge downside. The general idea of flip monsters is rooted in how classic Yu-Gi-Oh used to play out. Instead of summoning out a strong beat stick, you could instead use your single normal summon turn to set a monster with a powerful flip effect that could turn the tide to the duel on a later turn. Because in older Yu-Gi-Oh, these flip effects were generically powerful, and would act as some of the game's strongest removal and follow-up options available to you at the time. So if your opponent didn't remove them from the field by a card effect, they'd be punished by a potentially game-winning effect when it got to your turn, or when they ran over your set monster by battle. This strength was compounded by the fact that in older formats, removal options were a lot more limited than they are today. And in a lot of cases, your opponent would have no choice but to trigger your flip effects if they wanted to remove your monsters from the field. Counterplay still existed for flip monsters, but in older formats, if you set a monster, there was a strong chance of you being able to use your flip effects to win free advantage and tempo. However, while all of this was true in classic Yu-Gi-Oh, flip monsters are usually terrible in a more modern context. And the main reason why is unfortunately because of how flip monsters usually function. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, most of the game's strongest playmakers usually have effects that provide you with an immediate advantage in some way. Whether that's with Axis Code's pop effect to wipe your opponent's field, or Alubra's effect to add branded fusion from your deck to your hand, a lot of modern cards are designed for a faster game, so are just as fast and usually provide you with an effect that you can use instantly. And that's where the problem with flip monsters begins, because on their own, flip monsters don't provide you with any kind of usable advantage on your first turn. So you have to rely on other cards that let you flip your monsters face up as soon as possible, or just hope your opponent doesn't have any removal or negate options to deal with your set monsters before the battle phase. But this game plan is wholly unreliable because removal options have become a lot more common and easier to access, especially because of the number of powerful tools that exist in most players' extra decks. As a result, most decks that could play flip monsters usually default to playing cards which are immediately playable instead, in order to keep up with the current speed of the game. This meant that a lot of classic flip monsters that were almost overpowered in old Yu-Gi-Oh! Now very rarely see play in current competitive decks because of how slow and clunky they are when compared to more modern effect monsters. But the mechanic as a whole isn't entirely dead, and there have been a number of attempts to reinvent and redefine what it means to be a flip monster. A lot of these attempts have resulted in more failures, but some have resulted in some of the strongest flip monsters in the game's history. Let's start off by looking over 3 classic flip monsters that saw a ton of competitive play in older formats that had fallen off in terms of playability: Magician of Faith, Raikou, Lightsworn Hunter, and Gravekeepers Spy. Magician of Faith is a light spellcaster monster with pretty meager stats, but if it's flipped face up, you get to target any spell card in your graveyard and add it to your hand. The effect is simple and is representative of the design of a ton of other flip monsters that saw play in older formats, like Dekoichi and Magical Merchant. The idea behind these cards was that they all provided you with a +1 in terms of card advantage, effectively replacing themselves with another card whenever they're flipped face up. What drove Magician of Faith over the top and made it so ban-worthy was the power level of the spell cards that were available in older Yu-Gi-Oh! You see, while classic Yu-Gi-Oh! Is definitely a lot slower than the modern game, spell cards were even more insane back then than they are today, with the trinity of Graceful Charity, Delinquent Duo, and Pot of Greed all being legal. And because these cards were so generically powerful, just about every deck would play them. Magician of Faith made it so that you could recycle and reuse some of the strongest spell cards in the game, and provided you with devastatingly strong follow-up allowing you to reuse already game-winning unfair cards like Graceful Charity several times in a duel, which is why it was featured in so many different strategies. Because if you were going to play these absurdly strong spell cards anyway, it just made sense to play a card that lets you use them again multiple times. On the opposite end of the spectrum were flip monsters that act as removal options for your opponent's cards, like Night Assailant and Armed Ninja. But by far, the strongest of these kinds of flip monsters was Raikou, Lightsworn Hunter. Because whenever Raikou was flipped face up, you had to send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard, and you got a chance to destroy any card in the field. Both of these effects were benefits of the cards. Raikou Meal made it so you could end up triggering a beneficial graveyard effect like a Shadow or Dandelion, but most of Raikou's strength came from it being able to pop any card in the field. In older formats, removal options as a whole were generally less common, so monsters that can act as removal were already fairly strong. And most removal options were usually specific to a particular type of card. Raigeki is only going to be able to pop monsters, and Heavy Storm is only ever going to be able to deal with back row. But cards that could do both were somewhat uncommon and incredibly valuable, because it meant that with Raikou, every deck had a stable option that was capable of either taking down an opponent's boss monster that they overextended into, or could be used to deal with an opponent's oppressive floodgate, which gave Raikou a ton of versatility as a pop. And last but not least is Gravekeepers Spy, a flip monster that can act as a swarming tool. Because whenever Gravekeeper Spy is flip face up, you can special summon out another Gravekeeper monster from your deck with 1500 or less attack. And this includes another copy of itself, since Spy only has 1200 attack. So while Gravekeeper Spy was strong in Gravekeepers as an archetypal tool, the main reason it saw competitive play was that a ton of different strategies would use it as a way to swarm and bring free bodies to the field as quickly as possible. This made Spy a really strong staple that had a ton of versatility, since it could be used as a defensive wall, an offensive threat, or even as material for an even stronger monster. And how Spy was used would change in every different Yu-Gi-Oh generation. In early Yu-Gi-Oh, Spy was a solid advantage generator that also guaranteed you free tribute fodder for a Monarch monster. During Teledad format, Spy also gave you a free body that you could use as synchro material, and a Dark attribute also made it so it was a lot easier to turbo out Dark Arm Dragon. And in early Zexal formats, Spy was even a solid rank 4 generator. Essentially, swarming as a concept has always been a valuable thing in Yu-Gi-Oh! And Spy was one of the only reliable means of actually flooding the fields in older formats, before we had access to more archetypal tools. In the modern era, the concepts that Magician of Faith, Raikou, and Spy represent are still really important ideas, potentially even more so than back then. But despite how good these cards are conceptually, they never see any play in the current competitive format. This is because every one of these three monsters has the inherent downside of being a flip monster, which makes them far too slow and clunky for how fast the game has gotten. And with the constant evolution of the game's card pool throughout the years, there are now just better cards which do what these three cards tried to do, but better. There's no point in waiting a turn for Gravekeeper Spy when Buzzsaw Shark can give you an instant rank 4 instead. And why would you wait to flip your Raikou face up with Book of Taiyu for 1 pop when you have Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched to wipe your opponent's entire field? And why would you need Magician of Faith for follow-up when most archetypes already have strong archetypal tools that allow them to access their best spell cards anyway? These options are just stronger, better, and faster than most utility-based flip monsters in the game. And because of how vulnerable and slow flip monsters are, there's just never any reason to go out of your way to use them. In fact, there are even more modern variations of Magician of Faith, Gravekeeper Spy, and Raikou that all don't see any competitive play, because being a flip monster is just inherently a downside to the card, especially when compared to regular on-summon trigger effects. But even though flip monsters don't see any more generic play, they haven't been power crept out of the game entirely. It's just that their role in the game has changed. Instead of being the powerful staples they once were, the flip monsters that usually see the most amount of competitive play are ones that are centered to a particular archetype, with the most iconic being Shadows. The Shadow monsters are an archetype of flip monsters that use their incredibly strong spell and trap card lineup to access their powerful fusion boss monsters. But unlike most other flip monsters, the Shadow monsters have effects whenever they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect in a similar way to a card like Night Assailant. This actually solves one of the key issues that flip monsters have. Most of the time, your opponent can just remove them from the field before you have an opportunity to flip them face up, leaving you with nothing. However, the Shadow monsters don't have this weakness, because whenever your opponent tries to pop your set Shadow monster, you get the chance to punish them by triggering your Shadow monster's graveyard effects. So if your opponent tried to remove your face down Shadow Beast to stop you from drawing, you still get to draw a card when it's sent. Or if your opponent tried to stop you from using the bounce effect of Shadow Dragon, you still get to pop a spell or trap card they control. But that was just the worst case scenario, because with their strong trap-based support cards, you could easily flip up your Shadow monsters on your opponent's turn to get access to their powerful flip effects, like Hedgehog's Search or Squamata's Pop. These factors combined made it so that Shadows, a deck comprised almost entirely of flip monsters, was capable of dominating early Pendulum formats, and could contend against the likes of Cleafort and Burning Abyss. And even to this day, the strategy still remains evergreen, as more modern strategies like Invoked and Tearlaments will often choose to incorporate Shadow cards into their arsenal. However, while Shadows made these flip effects playable, they were never the main reason to actually play the strategy, because even back in 2014, the best cards in the deck were never the flip effects themselves. Most of the deck's power was concentrated in their fusion spells and fusion monsters. El Shadow Construct and Shadow Fusion were such big threats that in 2014, it was actually a detriment to have a monster summoned from the extra deck as part of your end board, as it meant that if your opponent had a Shadow Fusion, they got to summon a free construct and send any Shadow monster from the deck to the graveyard. allowing them to trigger whatever shadow graveyard effect they wanted and drown an advantage. Similarly, in 2023, the shadow monsters don't see play because they're flip monsters, they see play because they're a necessary requirement for summoning out El Shadow Winda. And as a result, the shadow flip monsters that see the most amount of competitive success aren't those with the best flip effects. It's those with the most beneficial graveyard effects that give you some advantage if you happen to mill them or use them as material. Which makes it so that, for most strategies, the shadow flip monsters are bricks. So in reality, while shadow monsters had their time in the competitive metagame, they're more of an example of the success of fusion summoning and floating effects rather than being an example of successful flip effects. Still, they're a notable part of the game's history, and whatever you attribute the deck's success to, the deck is still mainly composed of flip monsters that manage to see a lot of competitive play. However, there are still some strategies out there that have managed to see modern competitive success while specifically relying on their flip effects. Guru Control is one such deck that's reliant on a specific flip monster, Subterra Guru. Guru has 2 hard once per turn effects. Its flip effect lets you add any Subterra card except Guru from your deck to your hand. And while it's face up, you can target another monster in the field and flip both Guru and that target monster to face down defense position, with this being a quick effect if you control any other Subterra card. With Guru, you have a lot of interesting search targets, with your 2 strongest options being Subterra Final Battle, an archetypal trap card with a variety of beneficial effects, or Subterra Fiendness, an Omni-Negate while you control face-up Subterra monster. This forms a really compact but powerful engine that, when used with other strong control tools such as Floodgates, manages to form a really competent and meta-viable strategy that relies on a flip monster as a win condition. And the best part is, unlike most other flip monsters, you have an opportunity to use Guru's flip effect on your very first turn. You see, when you activate Hidden City, the archetypal field spell for Subterra, you can add any Subterra monster from your deck to your hand. If you choose to add a Guru, you can then set that Guru to your field and then use the on-field effect of Hidden City to flip it face up, so you can trigger its search effect. And even in hands where you don't draw Hidden City, you can rely on your Floodgates to slow the game down enough to the point where Guru's effect is virtually guaranteed to be useful. Now, if Hidden City didn't exist at all, Guru would be a lot less strong of a card since, like most flip monsters, it's not immediately useful by itself, and would likely have seen way less competitive play. But because of the archetypal tools that exist around it, it's been elevated to meta viability that makes it a fairly unique game plan. Guru being a flip monster is actually even advantageous for the strategy, as it makes it so you can easily play under your own Floodgates, and you can even use the effect of Red Eyes Fusion while still going through your full combo, since you never normal summon with the deck and only set. As a result, Guru is always on the fringe of meta contention. Never quite being one of the best strategies you can play, but it's always a solid anti-meta strategy, and a huge part of that is because of how its archetypal tools make it immediately usable, and provide it with solid payoffs that can actually be used to win games, rather than just generic card advantage. In terms of meta-viable flip monsters though, there really aren't that many, with the Shadows and Guru being the only real exceptions for modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Monsters are just inherently worse if you have to flip them face up, rather than being normal or special summoned, no matter how strong their effects may be, because in order to get access to these effects, you have to go through extra hurdles to actually flip them face up, which usually requires other cards or resources. Some flip monsters even have insanely powerful effects that are capable of shutting down your opponent completely, like Death Ex Crawler, a one-sided skill drain, and Guard Dog, which locks your opponent out of special summoning entirely. But there's no reason to ever use these cards when you can instead rely on easier to use Floodgates to do similar things. However, there are ways of making flip monsters more viable, as flip-based mechanics and monsters do occasionally have their place in the meta, and a lot of that has to do with the card quality that exists around these monsters. Even right now, one of the strongest rogue decks of the current format is Ninja, a deck that doesn't play any flip monsters, but relies on setting and flipping up their own monsters to generate advantage and disrupt your opponent. And a lot of that strength has to do with the strength of the archetypal cards that exist around the Ninja monsters, which allow them to easily swarm the field and flip themselves face up to activate their effects more often. Unfortunately, however, even though Ninja monsters use flipping to win games, most of the ninjas aren't actually flip monsters. And this is a huge benefit for the deck, as it means their effects don't just trigger when they're flip face up, they can also trigger on the normal or special summon. This allows the deck to reach a much faster pace that can keep with the likes of Kashtira and Branded, that it wouldn't otherwise have if it was a deck based entirely around flip monsters that could only use these effects when flip face up. Good flip monsters do still exist though, and despite how fast the game has gotten, there are still 3 flip monsters on the Forbidden and Limited list. And these are Morphine Jar, Cyber Jar, and Fiber Jar. However, Fiber Jar is only banned because it creates long and tedious game states that can hold up an event, making it similar to Self-Destruct Button rather than an actual ban-worthy threat. Morphine and Cyber Jar were extremely strong staples back when they were first released, since they could both be used to instantly refill your hand or field whenever they flip face up, making them really great follow-up and swarming tools. So strong in fact, they even became the centerpiece of their own FTK-centric strategy, Empty Jar, a deck based around milling out your opponent as quickly as possible by abusing non-once-per-turn flip effects of the Jar cards. You could even play this strategy to this day thanks to cards like Gallant Granite and A&D Changer, although, like most flip-based strategies, it's no longer an actual meta threat. As a whole though, it's really unfortunate how far flip monsters have managed to fall from grace. They were once powerhouses of early Yu-Gi-Oh! That were integral to the game's early identity, and provided a ton of different strategies with advantage, swarming, and removal tools that you wouldn't otherwise have. But Yu-Gi-Oh! Has moved on a lot since its early days, and has morphed into a much faster game with an environment that's almost inhospitable to most flip monsters. In almost every situation, you'd want a card that you could immediately use to combo or try to control the game, rather than a flip monster that you either need to wait to use or that you need other cards to use on your first turn. So because of the lack of support and their clunky nature, it's pretty fair to call flip monsters failed cards. It's usually only a detriment to be a flip monster in the modern era that need to be flip face up, unlike something like a ninja monster where there's a lot more flexibility in how their effects are triggered. There are examples of successful flip-based strategies that appear in the metagame that you can call successful. Shadow is still a competent threat, and Guru has even taught recent YCSs. So if you define a successful mechanic as one that has seen competitive play, then no, flip monsters aren't a failed mechanic. But if you think about how difficult the mechanic is to use, its lack of support, and how few flip monsters even actually see competitive play, it's definitely more of a failed mechanic than a successful one. So how could they be improved? The mechanic isn't completely dead though, and there are a number of ways that flip monsters could be improved to see more widespread play. There are a number of different solutions that you can take from other flip decks that have seen success. Future flip monsters could benefit from having alternative effects like the shadow monsters, or could instead have more archetypal cards designed around allowing them to be used instantly, like how Hidden City makes Guru playable. The mechanic could even be revamped entirely, and made to play in a similar way to modern ninjas by allowing their effects to also be used on the normal or special summon. However, what the mechanic needs more than anything else is more generic support. Some of the weakest subtypes in the game, such as normal monsters, have been made competitively viable thanks to support that exists around them. If flip monsters received similar such support, then there's a solid chance that even in the state they're in right now, flip monsters could become a viable threat. But as it stands right now, it's unlikely they'll ever reach the stable status that they once had. Alright, and that's the video. If you can think of any other ways to maybe fix the mechanic, or know of any other cards or mechanics that have failed, please let us know down in the comments so we can maybe make videos about them in the future.